Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're Zooming from. I'm David Rousseau of the Kaiser Family Foundation, where I oversee our journalism and digital communications work. On behalf of my terrific colleagues on the Media Impact Funders Board, I'd like to welcome you to the beginning of our 2020 Media Impact Forum. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're sorry that we don't have a chance to be together with you in person this year, but we hope that this year's virtual format will make it possible for more of us than ever before to connect around the ideas and opportunities we'll be discussing. Please join us for as many of these programs as you're able. At this time, every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 3 weeks. Today and in every program, we'll host conversations in a broadcast format with moderated discussion for a full hour. Then at the end of the hour, we'll invite everyone to join our conversation and offer questions and comments for an additional half hour. If you have questions along the way, please type them in the Q&A app, which you can find in the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll refer back to them and invite you to ask your questions live after 2 p.m. Our agenda for this year's Media Impact Forum is focused on addressing climate change through journalism and documentary filmmaking and other evidence-based communications, all of which seek to convey the urgency of a looming climate emergency. Even as we're focused on the urgent issues associated with climate change, we're also very much aware that the climate's changing on important social issues. And we're at a crossroads in our nation with regard to long simmering problems of racial injustice and still very much in the middle of a pandemic that's having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. As you'll see through our discussions over the next several weeks, these issues are not unrelated. Indeed, we'll be exploring issues of environmental justice, including the very real risk that the burden of climate change is likely to be borne by the same communities of racial minorities that have been disadvantaged in so many other ways. Today, we're so fortunate to have Amy Goodman, co-host of Democracy Now!, who's pursued fearless journalism with a racial justice lens for decades. And to start our program, she'll interview Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, a remarkable marine biologist who's engaged in a wide range of lively and informative media projects that seek to achieve climate solutions, especially for poor communities that are left out of environmental debates. Amy, now I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, David, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We are at a critical juncture right now. As we have this conversation today, over this next hour and a half, the funeral for George Floyd is taking place in Houston. That is the backdrop. And the intersectionality of the movements from those dealing with the pandemic and the disparate effects of the coronavirus on communities of color, those who have risen up right now against police brutality in the streets, not only of the United States, but all over the world. And those who for so long have been protesting and organizing and convening in global meetings around climate change and the disparate effects the climate crisis has on communities of color. I mean, this moment is all connected. And I can't think of a better person to talk to right now than Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Let me introduce her to you.
Lovely to be in conversation with you, Amy.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is founder and CEO of the Ocean Collective and founder of Urban Ocean Lab. She is a marine biologist, a policy expert, and a Brooklyn native. She's actually not far from me, but as we all shelter in place, we might as well be on different ends of the planet. She's founder and CEO, as I said, of Ocean Collective, founder of Urban Ocean Lab. Previously, Ayana co-founded the Blue Hail Initiative and led the Caribbean's first successful island-wide ocean zoning effort, resulting in the protection of 1/3 of Barbuda's coastal waters. She then led the growth of this initiative, launching it on Curacao and Montserrat in partnership with the governments and the stakeholders. And that's just a small part of what she has done and accomplished. I wanted to go to a piece, Ayana, that you just wrote in the Washington Post at this critical moment, where you quote Toni Morrison in a 1975 speech saying, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over again your reason for being." And I think we just can't avoid talking about this, even as we talk about oceans. The position you find yourself in now, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson.
I think the climate movement has done a pretty decent job over the last year, I'd say, of making this transition from climate solutions that are more sort of technocratic and policy oriented to ones that think about communities and think about justice. And so we've had this emergence and acceptance of the term climate justice, which is something people of color have been working on the whole time, right? But now that's become mainstream, but there is a little bit of this discomfort still amongst the sort of old school white environmentalists that say, climate is the most important. It's the thing that determines the future of humanity on this planet, and we need to be dedicating all of our resources specifically to climate solutions, as if like, you know, just changing laws in a vacuum or these sort of engineering fixes would get us there, when the problem is really one of humanity. It's a lack of leadership. It's all the best ideas not on the table. It's a lack of critical mass behind those ideas. And people like me who have been dedicating our lives to pushing forward climate solutions can't work right now because we're worried about our families. We're thinking about this moment in American history as an inflection point and trying to think about how we can be most useful in this moment. And that's meant, for me, there's a long list of, you know, to-do list items that have just had to fall by the wayside. And so that's what I was writing about in this piece, thinking about racism as a distraction from the work we would otherwise be doing. And that's something that has been throughout history. The things not discovered, the gardens not tended, the books not written, because there are all of these justice things people can't just ignore and work on climate. And in a weird way, people who don't care about climate justice or social justice, but are obsessed with climate solutions and environmentalism, my article really broke through in a way that I wasn't expecting, which is that people thought, oh, racism is inefficient. If you can't get your work done, if your productivity is suffering, oh, well, then I guess I should care that Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, it's not exactly the point I was trying to get across, but I'm glad that you're able to hear this. And so I've had some environmentalists who have never been involved in any justice-related intersection write to me in the last week and say, I get it now, which is, I'm not sure that they totally get it, but it's nice to be able to help people start to connect the dots there.
The headline of the piece is, I'm a Black climate expert, racism derails our efforts to save the planet. So let's not get derailed right now as we bring all of these issues together. Can you talk about how you became an oceans expert, Ayana?
I had these childhood experiences that a lot of people get to have, going to the beach and going to an aquarium and just being completely enamored with this whole other world that exists under the surface of the sea. And so it's just that childhood wonder and awe and curiosity. And then there was the moment I found out that that could be your job, like learning about all this stuff. And so like a lot of kids, I decided I wanted to be a marine biologist, and I was just stubborn enough and fortunate enough to be able to stick with that. And the reason that I actually followed it through all the way to getting a PhD was because I realized that it wasn't just about individual species or even ecosystems. Ocean conservation is this crazy, amazing puzzle where you have to look at sociology and culture and economics and policy and how science sort of fits into this network of ways that we understand the world and make decisions. And so that's what I'm just completely obsessed with, is how do we think about what the future could look like and incorporate all of these different disciplines to come up with ocean climate justice, culturally relevant solutions, which is super complicated, but endlessly fascinating and worth a shot.
So yesterday was World Oceans Day. If you could describe the overall crisis facing the oceans, whether we're talking about acidification, heating, coral loss, plastic waste, draw the big landscape for us.
So the ocean has really been buffering us from the impacts of climate change. The ocean has already absorbed over 90% of the heat we've trapped by burning greenhouse gases. That has led to the ocean temperature warming. The ocean has absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide we've emitted by burning fossil fuels, which has led to ocean acidification, which sounds very technical, but what it means is we've changed the pH of the entire ocean. We've changed the chemistry of seawater with all sorts of knock-on effects we're only just starting to understand. Fish are moving towards the poles. Obviously, this is a particular problem for communities that live in the tropics, where those waters are becoming too hot for some things to live comfortably. So there's a lot of effects of climate, including, and then there's sea level rise because the ocean is actually expanding as it heats in addition to the ice that's melting off of land. And storms are getting stronger and wetter, and that's because a warm ocean is basically hurricane food. It just feeds these storms. In addition to climate change impacting the ocean and the people who depend on it, we have overfishing, which has long been a problem, which is subsidized by governments, and there's a lot of illegal fishing and human rights abuses that go along with industrial fishing offshore. And we also have pollution from oil spills from plastic, which is also made from fossil fuels. I feel always the need to remind people that plastic is not some other material. It's just fossil fuels in a different shape and color. We're also sort of dealing with habitat destruction issues and runoff from land from the way we do agriculture and things on shore. So there's this huge suite of problems that can be broken down into climate change, overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction. And some of those can be addressed locally, but a lot of them are going to take some larger coordinated efforts.
And how might the ocean serve as a solution?
I'm so glad you asked, because the last piece I published actually just yesterday in Scientific American was about the need to flip this script from just looking at the ocean as something that is a victim of all of the stuff that we're throwing at it, quite literally, to seeing the ocean as the hero. The ocean has been buffering the impacts of climate change. And there's four, in the same sense as there are four main threats to the ocean, there are four main ways in which the ocean can be a major part of the climate solution that I think we should focus on and harness. And the first of those is renewable energy offshore. In particular, wind energy. We have 40% of Americans live in coastal counties. Imagine if we got most of our energy from offshore wind, floating solar panels. In New York City, where I'm sitting right now, we don't have enough space to put out fields of turbines or solar energy, but we are right near the ocean where we can be building those. So that's one thing that we can be focusing on. Another is coastal ecosystems. We think a lot about forests as something we should be protecting and restoring, but we don't think enough about mangroves and seagrasses and wetlands and oyster reefs and coral reefs as ecosystems that absorb tons of carbon as well as protect us from storms and sea level rise. Wetlands in particular can absorb 5 times more carbon than a forest on land. And so that should be, I think, a really big part of the solution. And during Hurricane Sandy, wetlands prevented over $200 million worth of damage to New York City, even though we had already destroyed 85% of them. So instead of just thinking about seawalls and fortifying our coastlines, we should be thinking about ecosystem restoration as a part of the solution as well. And then we can also look to the ocean as a source of food with a really low carbon footprint, thinking about seaweeds, thinking about kelp and oysters and mussels and clams and all these things that can be grown that require no food, no fresh water, no fertilizer, that just live off of sunshine and the nutrients that are already in the ocean. And the fourth one, in addition to the renewable energy and the ecosystem protection and this what they call ocean farming or regenerative ocean farming is algal biofuels, which is more in a formative stage, but we can be growing algae as a renewable source of fuel as well. And in a way that's much more sustainable than corn or other options on land. So I'm actually really excited about the next wave of climate solutions being something that are more thinking about blue carbon and the blue economy and the Blue New Deal as a complement to the green one as part of our way forward. Because if we ignore all of these ways the ocean is trying to be part of the solution, it really is a huge mistake.
And how does the current administration's anti-science, almost hatred, knee-jerk reaction to deny it, how has that stopped the work from moving forward? And what do you think are the most critical, urgent steps that need to be taken right now?
I think we really need to figure out permitting for offshore wind facilities. It's something that can take many, many, many years to go through, and that's not necessarily this administration. They haven't done anything to fix it, but that's been a long-standing problem in the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management. Just they need the staffing to be able to process all these permits now that these companies are like, we're ready and it makes financial sense and we have the science to prove that these places are meet the conservation goals as well. So that's one thing. But I think a lot of us who work on ocean conservation were kind of just hoping the Trump administration wouldn't notice the ocean existed. Because you can only ruin so many things. But in the last few months, we've seen them wanting to remove protections from marine protected areas and start to push for more industrialization of the ocean in terms of aquaculture. And so all of this is happening at the end. So there is an opportunity still to nip some of that in the bud. But this has not been an administration that's been friendly to the environment. We know that there's over 100 regulations that have been rolled back or are in the process.
Finally, Ayana, if you can talk about how the philanthropic community has supported your work, and what do you see as the critical gaps in support for both the research and the activism?
I think the gap in the activism is that funders have been really focused on supporting organizations, and especially more established ones, when the opportunity really is, I think, to go back to a patronage model, to just say, these are the leaders we need to support, let's just directly support them. Because most of the exciting work that I'm seeing is people are doing it as their side hustle. They have like whatever job they need to pay their bills, and then they're doing this really creative, inspiring, important climate and ocean work on the side. So I'm working on how we can develop like a climate genius award or some sort of way to support especially women of color who are doing this incredibly important work as their side hustle, and letting people have the financial freedom to make that their full-time job.
Which brings us to your book that you're writing, which is absolutely fascinating. Talk about the anthology as we wrap up.
I'm co-editing with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson from Project Drawdown an anthology that's called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And it's 40 women from scientists and lawyers and activists. And there's a lot of poetry and quotes and original art in this book. We've really tried to make it something welcoming so that everyone can find their role in this work. And it comes out in September, and we're using that as a way to launch this idea of a climate justice sistership instead of a fellowship, to support women and women of color who are leading on climate. So those two things go together. We've just really seen a small group of white men leading the narrative on climate, and so we wanted to use this book as a chance to highlight a full spectrum of leadership that is there, that's doing the work, all these ideas that we need to be sharing, this chorus, this mosaic of voices. So I could not be more proud of that work and the opportunity to shine a light on these leaders and the work that they've been doing.
Well, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, I thank you so much. This has been certainly horizon expanding for me. Actually, just the preparation of this interview, to see all your excellent work and your articles. And I have a remarkable woman warrior to follow in the future who is fighting to protect these oceans. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And speaking of women warriors, we're moving on to another one right now. And she is the Oscar-winning actress and activist, Jane Fonda. Jane, I had a chance to speak to this weekend. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to introduce a trailer of Fire Drill Fridays. That's the peaceful protests in the name of climate activism that Jane Fonda leads.
Are you angry? I hope you are frigging angry. This is a collective crisis that requires collective action.
We hold the power to change the political calculus in America.
We have power.
Do we want it? Now!
We have so much power.
Let our country awake!
And this movement is spreading so fast.
We're gonna go raise a ruckus. What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it?
We don't want you near us!
And we have to say no new fossil fuel development anywhere in the United States. And it must be a just transition that leaves no workers behind.
We may be stuck at home now, but we're not stopping.
We need action now.
We can't stop just because we're not together. This is our chance to reimagine the best our country can be.
Fire Drill Fridays will continue in a virtual setting until it's safe for us to take to the streets.
We are just getting started.
Jane, we're so honored to have you with us. Thank you so much for making time in, to say the least, both these perilous times, these times of horror, but also hopefully of opportunity as people organize all over the country and the world.
Yeah, you're the perfect person to talk to right now. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you know, I just watched one of your virtual meetings on Friday, where you hosted a panel of the Movement for Black Lives. If you can talk about the intersectionality of the different movements. You have started Fire Drill Fridays. You're deeply concerned about the climate crisis. Here we are speaking in the midst of the pandemic, where so many have sheltered at home if they're lucky enough to have a home and to be able to work from home for months. And now we're in the midst of this uprising against police brutality.
Yeah, it's a unique moment in history with the climate, COVID, and inequality, which is police violence. The same mentality that has brought about the climate crisis. The planet is ours to conquer. Natural resources are ours to monetize. Rape the earth. That mentality, the mentality that brought people from Africa here and claimed them not human, so we could still call ourselves a democracy, and put them to work on the land, taking land from indigenous people. That whole mentality is the same one that that brings racism and inequality to our country now. And we could have all the windmills and solar panels in the world, but if we don't change the fundamental sin, the original sin of this country, we're not going to make it, and we don't deserve to make it. And I just think that what we're seeing right now is so hopeful. The diversity of the protests, the support from all kinds of sectors of society. There's reason to hope.
What do you think of as the original sin of this country, Jane?
Well, racism. The fact that there could be a hierarchy of humanity, and some people, just because of the color of their skin, could be considered inhuman, less than human. That is the original sin. And a mentality that can do that to human beings sees no problem doing that to the earth.
So, Jane, if you could talk about how you started Fire Drill Fridays, what drove you to this?
It was last Labor Day, the beginning part of September, and I had been depressed, actually, because I didn't feel that I was using my platform as a celebrity to make enough of a difference, and I just didn't know what to do. And I read Naomi Klein's book, On Fire, A Burning Case for the Green New Deal, and it set me on fire. The way she wrote about Greta Thunberg, the way Naomi wrote about the science was so clear and resonated so much for me. Greta said, we have to behave like our house is on fire, because it is. We have to behave like we're in a crisis, and we have to leave our comfort zone. And so I moved to Washington, D.C., and together with Annie Leonard and Greenpeace, we decided every Friday, and we got an okay from the young people who had already claimed Friday. The movement that grew out of Greta's protest was Fridays for Future. And there's the Sunrise Movement, and they were all doing their protests on Friday. I didn't want to be some aging movie star bopping into DC and getting a lot of media attention and turning away from them. So we had a lot of meetings with movement leaders and with the young climate activists who really impressed me so much. And one of the things that makes me so proud about Fire Drill Fridays was there was never a stage full of white people. There was never a stage, especially full of white men. It was always very diverse: Indigenous people, women of color, Latinos, and a lot of young people. And it really took off.
And you got arrested a number of times, is that right?
Yes. Civil disobedience needs to become the new normal. We've protested and marched and petitioned and lobbied and haven't been listened to. And civil disobedience is the next step, putting your body on the line for what needs to happen, for what you believe in. It's throughout history, civil disobedience is what's changed things, whether it was Mahatma Gandhi in India, whether it's Martin Luther King, the young Black students sitting at the lunch counters, Rosa Parks sitting not in the back of the bus. These are all acts of civil disobedience that brought awareness to issues and allowed people to change history. And I thought, well, I'm famous, I'm old, and if I can do this every week, people are going to take notice, and they did all around the world.
And do you see a connection between how Trump has dealt with the pandemic and how he deals with the climate crisis?
Yes, there's so many parallels. I mean, you have to pay attention to science, to the medical experts. You can't just go on gut and feelings. You have to be prepared. You know, my favorite ex-husband always said, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I'm talking about Ted Turner. And he's very smart. And so I think that's a good, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. We were not prepared. And also the importance of having a strong central government. You can't deal with the problems that are quite vast unless you have a government that cares about people and that's prepared and willing to step up. But of course, for 40-some years, since Reaganism and Thatcherism, there's been a very determined effort to make people think that government's bad, The very people who need government now think that government is bad. It's not the size of government that matters, it's who the government's working for. And
Jane,
right now, it's not working for people.
Now, you have a long history of activism, and in addition to being, a prize-winning actor for all of these decades, and you continue that work right through today. But your activism from the 60s and the 70s, whether you were working against the war in Vietnam or working with and supporting the Black Panthers. In fact, you adopted a daughter from a Black Panther family who wrote a book, Mary Williams, and talked about how you saved her. You met her, what, at a camp that you were holding. But that kind of activism that you did then, comparing it to what you're seeing and the level of intersectionality of movements, what you see today, how does it compare?
There's been a maturing individually and socially for all kinds of reasons. More people understand that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our system works, that it doesn't work for people, it works for the wealthy, for big corporations, in particular the fossil fuel industry, which really right now controls our government and our economy. And more people across the boards understand this is wrong and are willing to say it and to stand up to it. In the past, like when I came into the anti-war movement, we were viewed as violent. We were viewed as, we were the rioters and the looters. Today, as you can see now, that the people who looted and were opportunistic, taking advantage of the protests, are gone. And the people left are focused. They know why they're there. They're proud to be there. And they're raising their message. And all kinds of people are joining them that have never done it before. I've been surprised how many new people are joining these movements. So it's a maturation. And, you know, for me personally, patience. As you get older, you realize things don't happen overnight. And so it's easier to not burn out and also to know how to talk to people who don't agree with you, which is very important.
And what do you see as the role of progressive funders, of philanthropy in movements and in working for change in this country?
Yeah. They're absolutely bedrock fundamentally important, the funders, because what we're up against is huge, vast fortunes. We don't even need to name names. Everybody knows who they are. We're resource poor. And because of the media funders that I believe will be watching this video, I just want to say that we will lose our democracy if we don't maintain local media. We need robust, expanded local media, and they're closing. I mean, they're dropping like flies, and it's very frightening. I know you know this better than anybody. We have to make sure that they are funded, that they not only are funded, but that they can afford lawyers, because usually the local funders, they're people of color, and they're often women. They're the ones that the mass media goes to get their info, but they don't get the resources, and that's what's needed, because they're willing to stand up. They don't have bosses that are taking money, for example, from the fossil fuel industry. They have less to lose, so they're braver to standing up and exposing the powers that be that's doing wrong, and they need help. And they need, you know, just about the climate, for example, so many people still don't understand that the majority of, almost unanimously, the climate scientists agree that we are facing a catastrophe, and that it's human caused, and also that we can do something about it. If you don't know that, and if you're not talking about it, then you don't care. And if you don't care, you don't take action. So we need the media to tell the story and to tell it right, and to get people talking about it, and to understand that it is intersectional. It affects national security. security, it affects the economy, it affects our health, it affects everything. I mean, COVID, in a way, is a result of the climate crisis and poverty. People needing to go into wild places where we aren't supposed to go and coming in contact with animals that we haven't been in contact with before and bringing viruses out. It's been true of SARS and MERS and AIDS and COVID-19. So these things are all interlinked, and it's important to fund media that will report accurately on it, I think.
I'm always fond of talking about the importance of media not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers when we cover war and peace, not brought to us by the financial institutions when we cover economic and racial inequality, and not brought to us by the oil, gas, and coal companies when we cover the climate crisis. Yeah. So many of these media organizations, I mean, over 40,000 journalists are out of work or furloughed, their wages cut. Across the board, across this country, so many media outlets, online and paper, are shuttered, are shut down. But this idea of the model of independent media, not brought to you by these corporations that might not approve of what you have to say.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And by the way, since there's an election coming up, we have to be sure that we're voting for independent candidates all the way down the ticket, people who aren't beholden to, you know, fossil fuel, for example. We have to find out, you know, who's funding them, and because that reflects what kind of people they are.
You know, it's interesting right now, as you've taken on power for so long, has the fossil fuel industry reached out to you or tried to shut you up? I mean, your platform at Fire Drill Fridays is at this point enormous, whether you're hosting a platform for the movement for Black Lives or whether you're out there getting arrested. What kind of effect do you feel your organization and your organizing has had?
I think we're building a community that is growing into an army, a nonviolent army. And that's what we need. I mean, as we see in the streets every day now for the last 10 days, when large amounts of people assemble in the streets, making their demands heard, things happen. And even the scientists say the crisis is so enormous and so immediate, and we have so little time, and the only way we're going to do it is if unprecedented numbers of people take to the streets. Scientists, you know, nerds who are usually under the radar saying, I'm not political, are saying this. And so what makes me happy about Fire Drill Fridays is it's reaching, I mean, 20,000 people were watching last Friday, and we've had 250,000 people watching us, and they volunteer. And we got 1,000 people to call their congressman in 1 hour.
So how do you conduct your Fire Drill Fridays in the midst of the pandemic?
How do we continue it?
Yeah.
Online, virtually. You know, by now I was going to be touring the country with Annie Leonard, the director of Greenpeace USA, because Fire Drill Fridays is part of Greenpeace. I'm proud to say, and we were going to be touring the country, building up this movement and getting out the climate vote, but because of COVID, we can't. So we're keeping it alive online, and it's working. People are looking, they're looking for what to do. They want to learn. There's a thirst now that I have not seen before. And I don't know, I feel so proud. I feel so proud of the organizers of the movement for Black Lives, of Black Lives Matter, many of whom are my friends. And I feel so proud of the people who are tuning into Fire Drill Fridays. They come every Friday, and all over the country, hundreds are volunteering to make phone calls and to get information that we need to make our voices heard. And it's also people are looking for community. You know, people are understanding that individually we're vulnerable. You know, the Vietnamese always said, one bamboo is not so strong, but a group of bamboo stalks tied together, they're stronger than an oak. And that's what we have to be, stalks of bamboo that are tied together and nobody can stop us.
In fact, do you think that what has happened in this country, the massive loss of life, well over 100,000 people have died. Even the New York Times said the number of deaths that President Trump is responsible for, the so-called excess, the surplus deaths, because we didn't act fast enough, because the president doesn't heed the science. He was just at a swab factory in Maine with his health secretary, Alex Azar. Even though the rules in the factory was you must wear masks, the health secretary did not, and neither did President Trump. And so the company has said they will throw out every swab manufactured during the time that they were there at the factory. But do you think the pandemic and people's understanding of the importance of science will actually lead to a deeper understanding of the climate crisis?
I don't know whether it will lead to an understanding of the climate crisis, but it is leading to an understanding of the depth of inequality in this country. I think a lot of white people didn't really realize, first of all, who are the essential workers? You know, who really make our lives run smoothly, and the fact that they are so exposed and at risk. I think that white people are seeing that the pockets of people of color who work in like meat processing plants and poultry plants and very often retirement homes seem to be deliberately put in danger. And it's like, oh my God, let them die is the philosophy coming out of the White House. Just who cares? Nobody's going to care about their lives. And see, what's happening in the last 10 days is everybody can see that we do care, that we will stand up and stand shoulder to shoulder. That is one of the main things that's coming out of COVID, the sense of inequality, and also the disregard of expertise, which is very important in relation to climate. We have to follow science. That's one of Greta Thunberg's big messages. Listen to the science. And let me just say, the science is saying we have 10 years to cut our fossil fuel emissions in half and then phase it out gradually until mid-century. 10 years to cut our fossil fuel. And right now we're going in the opposite direction. So this is so urgent.
Well, Jane, I want to thank you for spending this time with us in the midst of your very busy virtual and real life. Thank you so much for being there and for being there all of these years, for sharing your artistry, your art, your acting, and your activism.
Same to you, Amy. You've been there across decades. Thank you. I'm glad you're safe.
Thank
Stay
you.
that way.
Stay safe as well. And thank you for helping the whole community stay safe. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks.
Hi all, I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to thank Amy and Jane for that profound and enlightening conversation, making so many important connections, showing the way that concern for the climate needs to be rooted in environmental justice. And now we're going to ask Amy to change places as Alex Jakana joins the webinar to moderate our next discussion with Amy and Ellen Dorsey, Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund. And Alex is a former journalist with the BBC and currently Program Officer for Global Media Partnerships at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I'm very pleased to say that he's also a brand new board member of Media Impact Funders. So please take it away, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vince. And that's a great conversation we just had there. It's going to be a tough one to follow. Amy, thank you so much. It's great to be in the company of two amazing women, Amy and Ellen, Dr. Ellen Dorsey and Amy Goodman. So just a very quick introduction for each of them. I'm sure neither one of them really does need this introduction. Amy is known to many of us as a multiple award-winning broadcast journalist. She's a syndicated columnist, investigative reporter, author, And many of us will know her in the US and beyond as the host and executive producer of Democracy Now! That's a national daily independent award-winning news program. It's airing in over 1,400 public television and radio stations worldwide. And it's great to have you on the program, Amy. And then Dr. Ellen Dorsey, Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund. This is a private foundation that has focused on progressive social change in the fields of environment, democracy, human rights, and corporate accountability. Dr. Dorsey was awarded the 2016 inaugural Nelson Mandela and Graça Machel Brave Philanthropy Award for the work around divesting philanthropy in a coalition of over 170 foundations committed to deploying their investments to address climate crisis, as well as accelerate the work to address this climate emergency that we're discussing today. So thank you very much for joining me, both of you. And I'm going to start with a question that I will give both of you a chance to respond to, because when we look at the question of the climate emergency that we're having right now, Amy, in your conversations, including that one you've just had with Jane, you had a number of questions that talked about politics, leaders, governments, and then the relationship with the way they go about the business and the sort of climate crisis we have, and the intersectionality of a number of other things. But it's clear there is a connection between leadership, governance, as well as the emergency that we're facing right now in terms of climate. And so when it comes to this correlation, it becomes particularly close where the less democratic the governments are. What do you make of that correlation, Amy? The correlation between authoritarian regimes and resource dependence or extractive industries. From where you sit as a broadcast journalist with decades of experience, describe the scope of the problem for us.
Well, I think that issue of authoritarianism is very significant right now. When we see the powers in the world that are rising, whether we're talking about in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro, whether you're talking about President Trump in the United States, whether you're talking about Hungary or Duterte in the Philippines. But it is not just a bleak picture, though to say the least, the pandemic is very bleak. To say the least, the climate crisis picture is bleak. What is our salvation clearly is people rising up. And we are at a tipping point right now. Again, as we speak, the funeral of George Floyd is going on. That is what is happening behind us today. And it's hard to think of that having a direct connection to the climate crisis, but it does, because we're talking about disparities in treatment, inequality in this country, what causes a whole population to be more targeted, in this case by police that are becoming increasingly authoritarian. And you're seeing both, whether we're talking about police brutality, the pandemic, the targeting, the virus doesn't know, but knows vulnerability. And the health crisis in this country and around the world that separates people, or the climate crisis and the racial disparities there. You've got authoritarianism, but you also have movements, and we have never seen stronger movements, and they are feeding off each other right now. They are not separate. People are understanding. In the streets, you'll see the banners for George Floyd. You'll see the banners for Black Lives Matter, that the idea that people matter and they cannot be diminished. You'll still see the protest banners for around the climate crisis and extinction on the planet. And I think at different, in the coming weeks and months, you'll have different movements moving up and moving down, but everyone getting to know each other a lot more. And why the climate crisis activists will truly be reinforced right now and stronger is because of the Black and brown communities that are now in the streets, feeling their power with white allies, but now all coming together, knowing those same very forces that are killing them are somehow linked, whether we're talking about police brutality or the climate crisis. The question of who profits, who benefits, and who dies.
Ellen, let me put this to you as well and ask what you see. I mean, you're both a funder working in philanthropy, but an academic as well, who spent a lot of time reading, studying, and publishing around this. The correlation between authoritarianism, extractive industries, what does it look like from your chair?
Thanks, Alex. And it's wonderful to follow Amy, a shiro, and Jane. And I have to say that I was proud to have participated in several of the Fire Drill Fridays, including being arrested with my daughter, which was one of the better moments of my life, actually. It was really profound. I'm a funder and an academic, both as guises for being an activist, quite frankly. And I want to build off of what Amy said, that what we are witnessing right now is absolutely unprecedented, both in the intersection of systemic crises, from a humanitarian crisis of the pandemic, an economic crisis that's laying bare inequality in our society, to a human rights pandemic of racism, and then of course the climate catastrophe, and it requires a systemic response. And this is really for us in philanthropy to grapple with. We've never seen movements exploding at the level that we have. And for foundations, it's often hard to figure out how to fund movements or be comfortable with funding movements. But if we will achieve the system change required at this moment, we are going to have to fund at a scale that we have never done previously. And I want to come back to that. But I think what's also important to understand is that to tackle climate change means we must tackle economic power, including our own economic power. Slavery was an economic system. The abolitionists demanded that slaveholders walk away from enormous profit, and those that were profiting were deeply intertwined with the political system to repress the movements rising up for abolition. And that's true today with the climate crisis, where the fossil fuel industry, as Ayana said, the petrochemical industry, has been similarly intertwined with governments the world over, frankly, since the dawn of the discovery that fossil fuels had the capacity to generate heat and energy. And so the need to extract fossil fuels from communities required the state to be an agent of control of those communities, whether it was to suppress the communities, make the land and resources available, to criminalize protest, to arrest, torture, and imprison community leaders or activists, as well as journalists who would report on it. The relationship of extraction and authoritarianism is a deep one. It also explains the climate crisis today and how, against all credible science and the self-preservation instinct of the human species, we still have a climate emergency with only a decade left. That tells you how powerful the industry is. The wealth of these industries, created by these industries, has been simply shocking. And it also contributes to the deep inequality in our society. They use that wealth to pay off government officials, to pay off politicians in illegal bribes and in legal campaign contributions in the United States. The world over, from Nigeria to my hometown of Pittsburgh, where Vince and I went to university together, to address the climate emergency today, we have to look at the entire system. And we also have to, again, ask another economic class to walk away from their wealth for the survival of the planet. And we have to transform the energy base of our economy, as well as decarbonize virtually every industry. So I think this moment requires us to fix systemic drivers, not just one, but democracy, the extractive economy, racial, economic, gender, and social justice together. And philanthropy has a really important role to play. And I don't think we've been operating at the scale of collaboration. or to fund the movements that are standing up to that corporate capture of democracy and preventing us from getting the climate solutions that are urgently required.
Ellen, let's dig a little deeper into the economics, because when you flip it on the other side, there are those who would say, looking at the past 300 years, we've dug up coal, we've pulled up oil from the ground, and this has propelled the human race. This generation or the generations since have lived in a state of prosperity that humanity for thousands of years preceding that hasn't seen. Poverty has declined at impressive levels. Generally across the board, it's still very high, but when you compare it to generations before, and economic growth at a national level and at a global level has been tremendous. If you look at China from the 70s and China now, the number of people who are enjoying wealth, there's still very many who are poor. Do we have to challenge extractive industry in order to deal with, in order to have a cleaner, cooler climate? How do you convince people that you have to forego economic growth in order to have a cooler planet? Because that's what it looks like for some of them. Or is that are they saying it wrong?
Wow, it's a huge question. And there is no doubt that historically, great wealth was created, some prosperity was created, not all prosperity was shared. And today, we face a situation where, because of the climate crisis, those that are living the greater wealth and greater prosperity are more obligated, more responsible for ensuring that we prioritize a clean, safe, and affordable energy system upon which development can occur around the world. And our foundation is involved right now in a campaign called Shine, where we're trying to bring resources, both in forms of grants and investments, to reach the billion-plus people in the world that don't have access to electricity with distributed, affordable, clean energy, communities that could not be reached by the fossil fuel grid because it was too expensive, and now we can leapfrog that. We could be using as foundations our investment capital to support community-owned solar and wind farms in indigenous communities. We're working with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe to build a grid-scale wind farm that they will own. So there are solutions in the new energy economy that we in philanthropy should prioritize, that we should have our eyes set on for precisely the question you raised. And we have to get out of fossil fuels immediately. And we need to do that in ways that both weaken the power of the fossil fuel industry and its corporate capture of our democracy, and builds at our movements at scale very quickly. My foundation's been involved in the global fossil fuel divestment movement that came precisely out of the moment where we failed at getting a global deal on climate. We failed at getting policy passed in the US on climate change when all of the science was clear because of the money being poured into government inaction by the fossil fuel industry, by denying the science. So young activists began advocating for their universities to divest from fossil fuels. It spread very quickly across universities to church groups, pension funds, foundations. And now there's over $14 trillion in assets under management that are divested. It's not enough. We need to cut off all financing to fossil fuels from banks and insurers. We need to demand that our politicians refuse to take money from the fossil fuel industry. We have to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for climate damages through litigation. And we need solutions. And we need solutions that put racial and economic justice at the center. The Green New Deal, Green and Blue New Deal, and the kind of green recovery that's being advocated around the world, and also ensuring that those without access to electricity, those that have not benefited from development, in the past are at the center and forefront of what we do within philanthropy. We are uniquely positioned to address that issue of unequal development and the history of extraction.
Amy, you have spent decades covering this particular issue, among other issues, and I've listened to the questions you asked in the previous session and then the answer you gave earlier on to my first question, and I could see you highlighting the intersectionality between the racism, the inequality, the climate change problem. I think Jane made a good point about if someone has it within their psyche not to care about another human being's life, why should they care about the ocean? If they can kneel on someone's neck for 8 minutes until they die pitilessly, why should they care about a tree? So here's a question for you. Do you think this problem is solvable one piece at a time, or are we at a place where we're going to have to solve all of them at the same time? And then off the back of that, you could perhaps tell the people on this call, and many of whom are funders, what they can do as philanthropy in answering that question.
It's a very good question. I think the pandemic has taught us a lot. You don't just have to be altruistic to care about other people. But what the pandemic has taught us is if one person is sick in one country, we can all get sick. That is an absolutely critical lesson, and you could take it as selfishly as you can. If someone is sick in China, you might well get sick here. And I think that hasn't been lost on anyone, whatever political party, and it's a critical moment and place to start from. I also just wanted to address an issue that Ellen just raised, the issue of Standing Rock. And I think it goes to your point as well, that intersectionality, Alex. You know, we were covering Standing Rock extensively in 2016. And you have the Standing Rock Sioux, and it goes to your first question about authoritarianism. In this part, corporate authoritarianism. A pipeline company can move in the Dakota Access Pipeline and just place a pipeline next to native land and enforce and impose its will using the state's militarized police. It puts together all of these issues and go after a community of color, Native Americans. And in this case, the Standing Rock Sioux. You look at the pandemic, the epicenter of the pandemic right now, one of them in the United States is in Navajo land, on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico. That's where people are the sickest. And these issues are connected. And then it goes to the issue of media. Who covers, for example, the standoff at Standing Rock? We raced out there, we were covering it from afar, then we raced out there in the fall of 2016 as it was intensifying. We went to cover these remarkable actions of Indigenous people. So often the climate movement is led by Indigenous people. And in this case, they were protecting their own land. And as we were filming and then posting online, the filming of the security guards, you know, got all levels of militarized response, whether it's the sheriff's deputies, whether it is the company's security guards, unleashing dogs. And you remember President Trump just recently saying, we'll release vicious dogs on you. Well, they did that there, and they bit and they mauled the Native American protesters. We caught it all on video, and the video is critical, and that goes to the media. Whether you're seeing the horror of a slow motion murder of George Floyd, or whether you're seeing dogs bite Native Americans, a dog's snout fresh with dripping blood of Native Americans. We caught that, we put it online. And for all the corporate networks brought to you by the oil companies, who would say when I'd be invited into MSNBC or CNN and I'd ask the host after, how about some climate crisis coverage? The host would say, with all good meaning, we want to do more. But the executives say that they can't get the eyeballs on it. We posted that one video online of the dogs and the guards going after these incredibly proud, resilient, determined, and relentless Standing Rock Sioux, backed by other Indigenous communities. And I mean, within a day, there was 14, 15, 16 million eyeballs, or maybe that was double that, because views online. People do care. And that's why we need an independent media. When we cover war, not brought to you by the oil, gas, and coal companies. When we cover healthcare and the pandemic, not brought to you by the insurance industry. When we cover climate crisis, not brought to you by the oil, gas, the coal, and the nuclear industries. We need an independent media, and that is seen globally. That is absolutely critical, because we are all connected. And coming out of the pandemic, I'll just end with this. We see that the CARES Act and, the bailout for everyday people is hardly that. This is reinforcing and increasing the disparity between the powerful corporations who have gotten millions off of that and still fire their workers. Supposedly they got that to ensure their workers stayed. So you have an ever more increasing disparity, but you have an angry and more informed and caring, diverse uprising that's taking place around all of these issues.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Amy, Ellen. Really appreciate your time. As you can imagine, this is a conversation that could go on and go on. Really could fill a week here. But time has run out, and I must hand over to Vince right now. Just for those of you who are on the call right now, we'll have a Q&A session coming up, and Vince is going to give us details about how we're going to navigate that area, because I'm sure there are lots of questions that have arisen as you've listened to this excellent panel we've had. Vince, over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Alex, for leading that discussion. And certainly the conversation will continue for at least the next half hour. And as we're shifting here, everyone who's participating as an attendee will also be invited to come into the chat and into the discussion fully. And that's going to happen over the next minute or so. My colleagues will be inviting people who stay on for the Q&A to come in, and we'll see that. So if you wish to keep your video off as a new attendee, make sure to leave it off. And if you want to offer a question, put it in the Q&A and then raise your hand, and we'll call on you and ask you to do that. So we're switching gears. Just stay with us while we make the transition. Okay, so I'll just say in between the music you were hearing, for any of you who were with us at last year's Media Impact Forum in person in Philadelphia, you may recognize that was Ayana Johnson, who plays some wonderful modern jazz. So our first question comes from Tim Isgett. We're going to invite Tim to offer that question himself, if we can bring him up to the full screen. I believe we're going to be able to get this.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. You can turn your camera on, Tim.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with that right now,
Okay,
so
well,
apologies, yeah.
Feel free to ask your question.
Sure, yeah, great. Thank you all for this terrific discussion today. I was quite inspired by the discussion, particularly this notion of the interconnectedness of all of these crises, the climate crises, racial injustice crisis, human rights crisis. I'm with Humanity United, a human rights organization, and before I joined HU, I was with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And Amy, you may appreciate this, but you know, I was always very inspired by the big, bold idea that created our public broadcasting system in the US, which really came out of the Carnegie Commission in the 50s and 60s. And it was a big, bold idea at the time. And I'm just wondering, particularly Ellen and Amy, Alex, what are the big, bold ideas right now that philanthropy funders could come around, such that we are magnifying our impact by being together, rather than, you know, perhaps a splintered impact where we're all doing different things? Curious if you have thoughts on that.
Can I take the first stab? So I believe we need to collaborate radically and radically different within philanthropy. And if we believe that we are at an unprecedented intersectional systemic crisis moment, then we need to respond as such. And I would say there's a couple things that we should be doing and can be doing. First of all, climate is a human rights tsunami. It is and will continue to impact food systems, water, access to land, health, you know, total disruptions and migrations. And as such, really, we have to look at those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and build our strategies from there, because they will, in fact, pay the greatest price. So human rights funders have to be climate funders. And I would say that there are several things that we can all do if we approach the climate crisis as, in fact, a climate justice emergency. First, we have to put climate in every one of our missions, no matter what our historic mission. Second, we need to be funding the movements at scale to win, and that means intersectional movements. We have to be funding systemic change, not just reform. And if we're not comfortable with the kind of advocacy and movement level funding, we can buddy up and help each other get comfortable. We need to invest our money consistent with an understanding of climate justice and racial justice, hitting on the second question that was posed. We are not just a grant-making institution. We have banks. We have money that is sitting on the sidelines, either being deployed to advance the crises by investing in fossil fuels or prisons, or we're using our resources to help solve the problems. So aligning our money with our grants. And then this is what I would say. What could we do? Pay out. Pay out way more than the 5%. Why are our foundations squirreling away acorns for a colder winter? We need to be paying more now. We should be paying out at minimum 10%. Why are we, if we really believe we have a decade left to turn the climate crisis around, spend down. Pay out half your endowment over the next 10 years. We need to resource movements at scale to win, and we're not going to be able to do that with business as usual. So think about that. Look at charitystimulus.org, because we're proposing that the mandatory minimum for foundations is lifted from 5% and made to be 10% for the next 3 years, and for DAFs as well. It would bring billions into the recovery and for job creation and hopefully a green recovery.
Ellen, you've talked about this today in terms of climate, but I think you also at Wallace Global have been framing some of the thinking about pushing for larger payouts in terms of COVID response as well. And certainly we've seen massive stimulus out of the government compared to normal government spending. So there's a parallel there if you want to just add the COVID piece to that as well.
Well, I think what we understand is that when we have now it's 30 million out of work, and we have the impact that this has had on the not-for-profit sector, as Ayana said, we're impacted by our stay at home. We've put resources not just into, quote, COVID relief, but in really helping our organizations respond to the change to digital organizing. We've been supporting the Poor People's Campaign and helping them move to digital organizing. We're also working on issues that are in fact impacted by COVID, the energy access, clean water, et cetera. But the point is we're paying out 20% of our endowment this year.
Yeah, that's
there's
amazing.
So much that we can be doing with more resources, including collaborating. And if there ever was a time to step out and do more, it's now. Even if you don't intend to spend down, just paying out 10% over the next 3 years would bring extraordinary resources that would not take away from government resources.
Right. Well, let's just open it up to anybody else who wants to talk about the intersectionality and the opportunity for philanthropy to collaborate across silos.
I'd love to add on something to what Ellen was saying. This obvious metaphor is so perfect of like, this is not the time to be squirreling away your acorns for a cold winter, because the cold winter is probably not going to come again, right? And so I think a lot about that when I think about the importance of supporting the leaders that arise. And that's kind of what I mentioned before, the importance of supporting people and not organizations. I think we're seeing a lot in organizing right now. People move around. Obviously, organizations are what is the glue in a lot of things that holds movements together, but I think we need to be a lot more creative and think about how to support individuals, designers, activists, scientists who are leading this like new generation of like much more fluid professional lives. I've been able to crack that code for myself, but a lot of people haven't been able to do that. And the number, we talk about the intersectionality of these things, the number that sticks in my head is 23 million. So 23 million years ago was the last time that we had this much CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's also the number of Black people in America who are already concerned about the climate crisis. But how can we expect them to be leading their communities when they are distracted? We are distracted with all of these other immediate term needs. So figuring out how to connect those dots. And I think there's this opportunity by taking a more intersectional approach to unleash this huge potential, because we know from the Yale Climate Communications Center that 49% of white people are concerned or alarmed about climate change, but that's 57% for Black people and 70% for Latinx people. So if we don't broaden the scope of who we're reaching and including, it's not just bad because diversity is like a good, nice to have thing, or we feel bad if we don't do it, or we know the science of diversity leading to better decision making among teams, but it's also just like, do we want to win or not? Because these are people who already care. The 23 million Black Americans who already care but have to deal with all these other day-to-day things and can't be engaged in climate solutions is just like tattooed in my mind now.
Great. I want to just remind each of you, the panelists, if you want to ask a question of each other, you're free to do that as well. But Amy, do you want to say something about
I also want to talk about piggybacking off of what both Ellen has said, also what Alex has said and what Ayana has said, just how critical media is, because you have organizations and leaders on the ground, and where is that forum for people to speak to each other globally? We may not know each other now. As people shelter at home, you have all these new technologies, but a common table. I always think of the media, a kind of independent media. It is a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most critical issues of the day, whether we're talking about racial injustice, inequality, the climate crisis, war and peace. And that dialogue is critical, and bringing forward the voices of people who are on the front lines of the streets risking their lives, not your typical set of pundits that you get at these oil-funded networks, right? Who know so little, a small set of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. But hearing that great diversity of voices of the people who are most impacted, and actually, when having a forum for their voices, the most creative, feeling the most urgency in coming up with a more creative, equal, egalitarian world.
Maybe, I'm sorry, Alex?
Yeah, I wanted to very quickly, Tim, that was an excellent question of what's the big, bold idea? And there is no silver bullet. There is, at least from where I sit, but as a funder, there are some things that I have found interesting that we're kind of looking for a tide that will lift all boats. After this discussion, it's clear there is an intersectionality and there's a connectedness. So are there some things we can invest in as funders that would help lift all boats, at least to a certain point? And I'll share with you what my experience has been and what I think might be helpful. One is gender equality. We have found, at least for me, that in places where we have been trying to deal with, say, routine immunization, family planning, you're trying to deal with education, you've got a number of different things, nutrition, that are connected all together. When we have made investments that have gender equality at the heart or put women in the driving seat, a number of other issues we've been trying to solve tend to get better. Those indicators get better. They're not all together solved, but it shows us that there is a lot of untapped potential that mostly patriarchal societies that have had men at the driving seat have left off. So there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of solutions that gender inequality has created. So we're running we're faring at half the potential we could as a human race. So addressing racism, structural inequality, authoritarianism, climate change with one arm tied behind our back is to do ourselves in. So as funders, I'd say we make sure that every investment we make has some form of indicator that can qualify it as passing a gender equality investment, and then point it as a barrel to whatever it is we are prioritizing, whether it's open governance, climate change, family planning, routine immunization, take your pick. And I suspect, as the data is showing, at least for some of the investments we're making now, that we will see a rise in a number of the other areas. The second thing would be to make investments that make highlighting solutions their priority goal. We're living in a world where people are already inundated with the scope of the problem. There is no shortage of outlets, whether it's by legacy media or with the democratization of content generation now, user-generated content through social media platforms that tells them the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And sometimes it can be demoralizing, and in a highly polarized setting, it opens the door for advocates of polarization to actually keep pushing and drives people farther apart. If we highlight investments that show people that, hey, look, this country was able to solve this problem at half the budget of the other country that is much bigger, has more people, has millions in their Federal Reserve Bank or whatever, it removes excuses for inaction from the Washington DCs and the Londons and the Berlins. If Kigali can do it at half the budget, having come out of the genocide, whatever the problem might be. So that might be a helpful investment for us as investors to look for which investments, which initiative has solutions as the primary goal, as opposed to trying to get the problem. And then finally, if we can find a way of making investments that focus on LMICs, that's low to middle income countries, I suspect we'll go a long way. According to the World Bank, 9% of the world's population live in low income countries. and 76% in middle-income countries. So the vast majority of the world are in this bracket. So imagine if we could move the needle on climate change, name it, inequality in that particular bracket there. We change it for the human race. Over.
Great. Well, wonderful ideas, all of them. If I could just pick up on, I'm going to come back to you, Ayana, in just a second. Alex, with regard to the solutions approach, I think, if people could stay tuned for the coming programs over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be coming back to that theme several times. And then I did want to circle back to you, Dr. Johnson, particularly around the gender equity piece, because you already introduced in the first part of the program the anthology project, and I know it's such a rich opportunity with regard to all of the things we've been talking about. You've got 40 different women's voices, and so many of them need to be brought into these media discussions too. So if you want to say what more practically can be done to bolster that project, or wherever else you wanted to take the comment.
Thank you for asking that. We are actually, our edits on the full manuscript are due tomorrow. So after that, I will be able to turn my attention more fully to how we want to roll this out and share this with the world. The publication date is September 22nd. So if there's anyone who has ideas about how to highlight the individual voices of the women in the book, the chorus as a whole, I would love to hear from you. We're also going to be launching this in a much more virtual way than we'd intended. So I'm sure some of you have expertise on what that would look like. But to sort of perhaps overly summarize Alex's first point, I think there's a huge opportunity by investing in women of color. Most of the money on climate has gone to white men, organizations that they run. And so we really are tying, 1.5 hands behind our back if we're ignoring people of color and women. And so that's one of the things I would really like to see, especially because from my vantage point, we're in the midst of this feminist climate renaissance where women are approaching these issues in a much more collaborative and supportive community building way, and we need to be sort of investing in the weave between us, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And the last thing I would say is I would love to see funders think more like venture capitalists, in the sense that you have a portfolio of 10 or 20 projects or companies or investments, and if 2 of them do really well, you're pleased. And that allows you to take bigger risks and not assume that everything is going to succeed. A lot of the experiences I've had with funders is like, how do we know this is going to work? I'm like, we don't have any idea if it's going to work. This is our best guess at what is needed. And I think, while people are thinking about spending more money and spending down endowments, like, this is a great opportunity to say, like, why not give this new thing a shot? Because the thing we know for sure is what we have been doing hasn't actually stopped climate change or gender inequality. So let's take a few more risks and invest in women of color and think about the narrative around that. And the motivation for this book was that none of these women were going to stop and write a book about their work. And we need them to keep doing their work, but books are still the path to thought leadership in much of the Western world. So how could we just pull them all in? Just write an essay, or we'll like remix your TED Talk into an essay, or whatever it is, and just as a way to get these ideas the audience that they deserve. So I'd love to talk with anybody who has some creative ideas along those lines, because I'm sort of new to this storytelling.
We're happy to make connections with anybody who's listening now on the live broadcast of this, and we'll be posting all of this on our website for anybody to watch at any time. So certainly we can, at Media Impact Funders, we can make the connection to strengthen that project and strengthen the how that resonates onward into the media ecosystem. Also, so important to mention that books are an important medium, as well as public radio. I see that there's a note in chat. It's not really a question, but a comment from Bill Siemering, who's really the godfather or the grandfather of one of the great founders of our public radio system, saying that the public radio system can re-envision their role to focus on these issues in their communities as they are independent. They can have their eyes on the street, become more inclusive, and become green stations. So that's a great idea from Bill Siemering. And I think we've pretty much come to the end of our hour and a half together today. I want to really hope that everyone who's listening in on the discussion today comes back on Thursday and every Tuesday and Thursday for the next couple weeks until June 25th. And when you do, I hope you have more questions of your own. As you can see, we can keep the time filled up, certainly with dialogue across our panelists, but we certainly want to also invite questions from everyone who's participating in these discussions. And so thanks, Alex and Amy and Ellen and Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson for illuminating our world today. Thank you all.
Thank you.